Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. I'm a huge zombie apocalypse fan. I'm not one of those crazies who actually want to live in a zombie apocalypse. I mean, I know that would be terrible, but I am really interested by that genre. For me, zombie films are one of the ultimate what-if scenarios. What happens to the average person during one of these events? Your life priorities go from trying to succeed at your job to trying to survive to the next day and not be eaten. What kind of skills from your previous life are important now? What kind of people survive? These are actually the questions I'm really interested in. Now, to be honest, I really hate horror films and I don't really like gore or body horror. And so what I'm interested in seeing in these type of zombie movies is how communities come together and coexist, survive, or break apart and eat each other alive. I want to see how humans create tactics to beat back the waves of undead humans, what kind of ingenious weapons and defenses they can make out of everyday items. I want to see the lore and detail of how the zombie plague spreads, where it came from, who failed to contain it, and so on. This is why, by the way, I'm a huge fan of the World War Z novels, which do an excellent job of mixing some light geopolitics with the zombie apocalypse. Now, as a big zombie genre fan, I'll watch any movie that falls into this category, but in recent years I've noticed the content's becoming more stale and repetitive and just not as interesting. That was until I found the movie Train to Busan a few years back. Now, Train to Busan doesn't really do anything new for the zombie genre. It doesn't really transform things, but everything it does do, from character development to pacing, is done extremely well. More importantly, it's a foreign film, a Korean film, and it introduces a lot of new tropes and perspectives that you might not see in your own domestic film market. So the Train to Busan actually led me to become more fascinated about the Koreans' take on the zombie apocalypse. That would ultimately lead me to a movie called Rampant. Rampant takes place during the Joseon Dynasty in Feudal Korea. The movie was okay, but it really piqued my interest about this time period in Korean history, and that leads me finally to the Netflix show Kingdom, which also takes place in that same time period. Today we're going to be discussing the show Kingdom, what kind of zombie plague they've cooked up, how it works, and what kind of weapons and tactics the humans use to defend themselves from these zombies. In the world of Kingdom, the zombie plague, spoiler warning, comes from a plant known as the resurrection plant. It's a small purple flower that grows in cold areas, and it's a host for a type of parasitic worm's eggs, which enter the bloodstream of a human host and essentially turns them into a human flesh-eating monster. If one of these zombies bite another human being, they can transfer the eggs to the new host, which is a vector for infection. Anyway, this plant has grown in the Korean kingdom for quite some time, and top positions in the country were aware of its existence and its terrible symptoms. But for some reason, they still used it in very extreme circumstances, which makes me really question, how safe the Korean healthcare system was back then. The plague in the TV show begins when the king of the Joseon kingdom passes away from smallpox. Greedy court officials who want to maintain their position in the kingdom try to use the resurrection plant to keep the king alive long enough until the queen regent can give birth to a new heir, who they will control like a puppet once he is on the throne. Now, initially, when the zombie king bites one of his servants, the boy succumbs to a fever and then eventually passes away. He doesn't actually turn into a zombie. This is kind of the more passive version of the zombie plague, but things do get worse. The Koreans had actually used the same procedure to weaponize an entire village of lepers years earlier to defeat a massive invasion of 30,000 Japanese soldiers. The bites of these lepers also didn't turn the Japanese soldiers into zombies. Instead, it just made them all ill and die as well. The disease didn't spread because it didn't create more zombies, and the Japanese were defeated. But then something horrible happened. The boy who was bitten by the king is taken back to his home village in the countryside. The Korean peninsula has never been an especially fertile place, and the corruption of the bureaucrats and mismanagement has led to widespread starvation in the kingdom. And so the boy's body is taken by a well-meaning hunter who cooks the boy in a giant soup cauldron and then serves it to the starving people of a medical clinic. The people devour the soup, as most of them have not had meat in months, if not years, and hours later, they all die. And hours later after that, they come back to life as zombies. Now, these zombies are different from the zombies that I mentioned before. When they bite another human being, they actually do turn them immediately into another zombie. This is a problem. Luckily, the parasite worm has two major weaknesses. It doesn't like warm weather, and so during the summertime when the sun comes out, the zombies hibernate in dark areas where there is shade. Unfortunately, winter is coming, and when winter comes, well, the zombies will never rest. The second thing that the worm hates is water, and so if an individual is bit by an infected zombie, it will try to avoid water. Better yet, if a person who's bitten by a zombie manages to submerge themselves in water before the worm can make it to their brain, they can actually survive the attack and not become a zombie. The quickest way, of course, to kill these zombies is by destroying the brain or removing the head from the body. So, the show Kingdom is set in the middle of the Joseon Dynasty in Korea. This is one of the most famous and culturally rich periods of Korean history, and it also is a very long period, which spans from 1392 to 1897. We're not exactly sure what year the show is set in, but there is a major Japanese incursion that occurs 3 years before the show starts. That's the thing we were talking about with the lepers before. So this could be in the late 16th century when the Japanese carried out several invasions of the Korean peninsula known as the horrific Imjin Wars. We can also get some more clues about what time period this is by looking at some of the firearms used by the Joseon military forces. The Koreans have had access to black powder since the mid-14th century. As a tributary state to the Ming Chinese dynasty, they received their first shipment of cannons and gunpowder in order to protect themselves from encroaching Japanese pirates. The handheld matchlock musket we see the aforementioned hunter with a heart of gold and cannibalistic tendency uses is something that is a bit more high-tech and would appear 100 or so years later, during the Imjin Wars actually. The muskets we see the Korean forces use is very similar in shape and design to the Tanegashima or matchlock muskets introduced to the Japanese by the Portuguese Empire. The Joseon Kingdom was said to have produced their own local matchlock muskets as well, which were of very high quality and oftentimes even gifted as tribute. This is most likely what we're seeing being used in this show. A matchlock has a slow burning match cord or fuse which can be lowered into a flash pan and ignite the priming powder, which then ignites the propellant for the projectile inside the musket. Because of this burning cord, matchlocks were not the most reliable weapons, especially in wet environments or maybe windy environments. Later on, flint would replace the matches as the primary ignition, making them far more reliable. Matchlocks are far inferior to modern firearms when it comes to firing rate. This is because instead of having prepared rounds which can be loaded in a magazine, the projectile is individually loaded along with some black powder between each shot. A swab also is needed to clean up the residue inside the barrel to prevent a potentially dangerous misfire. A trained musketman with good cover can maybe get off a few rounds a minute during a battle, which makes this a terrible anti-zombie weapon. You want faster firing rates. Now, one of the advantages that musket balls have over, let's say, modern bullets is that they're quite large and heavy. So even if there is less speed in the projectiles of a matchlock musket, when it hits, it can do a lot more damage and stop the momentum of a zombie relatively easy because of all that weight behind the projectile. Modern firearms with full metal jackets will probably do a lot less damage to a zombie because they'll just go right through their flesh. We also get to see in one scene a mobile siege weapon, which is essentially a bunch of cannons or blunderbusses placed on a cart that can fire scatter rounds. It's basically a gigantic shotgun. I love seeing stuff like this. It's really cool. Now, because rate of fire is important when it comes to stopping a horde of zombies, the Korean bow or gakgong becomes your weapon of choice. These were composite bows made up of bamboo and sinew at its core and water buffalo horn on the belly area. Korean bow is not all that different from your standard Eurasian composite bow from that time period. They were relatively small but extremely powerful for their size. The draw weight of these bows differ depending on the quality and design of it, but usually it was more than 20 kilograms. Even with the introduction of arquebuses and matchlock muskets, the Joseon Dynasty still heavily relied on composite bows for the majority of its military forces. Bow and arrows have the advantage of being silent, and a skilled archer can loose dozens of rounds in a minute, making it far more effective than an early firearm. The weight of these projectiles are also quite high and have the added benefit of being able to stop the momentum of those godless zombies. Bow and arrows are relatively easy to source and create from, materials that you find just in the forest. Matchlock muskets are a lot more complicated. Arrows can also be lit on fire and be used to set off fire traps, which are very helpful at redirecting zombies who, as we mentioned before, hate fire. Matchlock firearms became very popular during the Imjin War against the Japanese, but even then, it wasn't necessarily the physical damage that the matchlocks did, it was the psychological damage, because Korean forces would eventually adopt volley fire tactics, which I imagine are very terrifying to try to charge against. But since zombies are mindless and controlled by parasites, arrows win the damage per second argument in this case and are the preferred method for killing zombies. While the Korean sword or Fuedal looks just like a katana, it's actually a little bit different in important ways that makes it probably better for fighting off zombies. The Fuedal, like the katana, was made out of high-quality forged carbon steel. Where it's different is the fact that its blade is wider and has a thinner cutting edge than a katana. It's said that the Fuedal is superior at cutting through human flesh, and because it's lighter, the user actually exerts less energy, which is a really good thing. While the katana might be a superior weapon against an armored foe, the Korean Fuedal is great for tackling multiple unarmored assailants who want to bite your face off. The energy one expends to behead a zombie is significant. Fighting multiple zombies means you'll want the most efficient blade possible. The Fuedal seems to have a good mix of durability, cutting edge, weight, and speed, making it a very ideal sword for this type of business. Now, we don't see many polearms or spears in the show, and we don't see any shields really either. It should be mentioned in early Korean history, the majority of land battles at the time took place in strategic chokeholds created by the country's mountainous terrain. Spear and bow were actually far more popular in these earlier days, and swords were kind of like a secondary weapon. They were mainly used for close quarter fighting and also for fighting on ships. Swords back then were treated in a very similar way to the way we treat guns in our modern society. Ownership was limited to the military and nobility, and commoners generally didn't have access to this status symbol because the government was afraid of rebellion. Although nowhere near as large and complicated as the fortifications found in neighboring China or Japan, the Joseon Kingdom did have impressive fortifications erected in many parts of the country, including thick stone fortifications, which happen to be one of the best defenses against a horde of zombies. We see that smaller local garrisons use cheaper wooden palisades for defense. These walls are much lighter and can even be tipped over when a large amount of people start climbing on top of them. They don't seem ideal against zombies, especially hordes of them who can sense that there is meat behind the walls. The Crown Prince and his squad also erect various types of barricades and pit traps to stop zombie hordes from advancing on their positions. But for the most part, the significant weight and mass behind a zombie horde can really only be stopped by stone fortification, or one of their great weaknesses, water and fire. So Kingdom really does add a lot of new things to the zombie genre in my opinion, and also it brings all that lore and culture, the history of the weapons. I think it's really cool. I mean, Feudal Korea is definitely a very interesting place to see on TV. Anyway, if you guys like this video, we'll probably do some more coverage of Kingdom on our other channel called Generation Ochi, which covers anime and also Eastern cinema. If you guys like this video, we'll probably also cover some other TV shows and movies that have zombie apocalypses, but before the invention of modern firearms, because honestly, it's a lot more interesting, right? I mean, machine guns kind of make things a little too easy. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.